Please do join us this afternoon for a Zoom conversation about this sermon at 4 p.m. You'll find the link to join us at the Zoom meeting almost anywhere that you find the video link. So we always enjoy meeting our audience. It's been almost 20 years ago now that a Kansas City pharmacist, Robert Courtney, made national news when he was arrested for selling cancer chemotherapy drugs that he had watered down in order to make more profit. Once apprehended, he confessed to having sold diluted and therefore virtually ineffective medication to more than 4,000 patients, allowing him to fraudulently pocket several $1 million. I remember hearing about Courtney in the news and finding it difficult to believe. How could he? I had worked as a pharmacist assistant when I was in high school and in college. I remember how careful we were to be absolutely certain that prescriptions were filled properly, and on many occasions when poor patients with a very sick child couldn't afford the expensive antibiotics that had been prescribed, the pharmacist would reach into his own wallet and pay for the medications. I couldn't imagine a pharmacist intentionally watering down life-saving drugs, literally killing thousands of cancer patients so that he could make some extra money. But folks, he did it. He did it for years, evidently without remorse, without qualms. I want to believe that most people are basically good. I want to believe that most people are fundamentally honest. In fact, I do believe it. I'm convinced that if you're walking down the street and drop a wallet full of cash on the sidewalk, that most people will pick it up and chase you down and give it back to you. However, it is important for us to realistically also acknowledge that everyone isn't honest. Everyone isn't fundamentally good, and that some people are so self-centered that they believe that whatever they do for themselves, if it is good for them, it just doesn't matter what it does to you or anybody else. This month, as public schools are opening for in-person classes, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis and Texas Governor Greg Abbott have forbidden schools from making mask wearing mandatory. At this point in the COVID-19 pandemic, there is no one who does not know that wearing a mask when you're inside a building around a lot of other people dramatically cuts down on the rate of viral infection. Everyone knows that school children will infect one another and that those children, before they show any symptoms, will go home to infect their parents, their grandparents, their siblings, and neighbors. There is no way around the fact that thousands of people will die in Texas and Florida from COVID infections because of these anti-mask mandate policies of DeSantis and Abbott. So why would they do it? The governors of Texas and Florida are killing school children and the families of school children with this policy in a horrifying race to see which one of them can most apparently become the successor to the Trump legacy, allowing them then to get a larger share of future political donations and votes from the lunatic fringe in the next presidential election. The governors, Abbott and DeSantis, are knowingly and intentionally killing thousands of people in their states in order to get political donations and votes. That seems almost too harsh to say. It's too cruel. It's too sociopathic to believe that the governors of large population states could do that. They couldn't possibly be that evil. It's hard to believe. And yet, it is inescapably true. Which is why I began by reminding you of our Missouri pharmacist, Robert Courtney. Some people are malignant narcissists. Some people will place their personal fortune above even the lives of those that they are supposed to be serving. What is different about the pharmacist and the governors is that the pharmacist went to prison. He's out now, but he spent 20 years in prison. And one of these governors may have actually found a pathway into not prison, but the White House. We don't want to think about politicians being so hungry for power that they would do to the country what Robert Courtney did to his cancer patients. But, and here, folks, I'm begging you to seriously think about what I'm saying. American democracy is not a permanent fixture. It's not set in concrete. It can go away, and it could be replaced by fascism very quickly if we are not all committed to defending American democracy and remaining vigilant in our defense. And believe me, I get it when people say they are just exhausted with politics, with bad news, with hysterical rhetoric from both the left and the right. We just want the government to work, to do what it's supposed to do, and leave us alone. The Trump administration certainly did not make America great again, but his insane and corrupt administration did two things well. It made Saturday Night Live worth watching again, and it drove up the ratings numbers of virtually all forms of news. TV, radio, print media, podcasts, online magazines. Heck, even our downloads went up every month during the 4 years of the Trump administration as more and more people tuned in to join me in being mad as hell about all of the horrifying things that our Clementine Caligula did every day. But I'm tired of talking about Trump and treason and tyranny. I'm tired of listening to and reading news all the time. I have not read a fiction novel for pleasure for 4 years. I'm tired of leaning forward in the saddle all the time. I want to go scuba diving. I want to go to flea markets and look for classic rock and roll albums. I want to go out to a comedy club and laugh with total strangers without even having to care who they voted for in the last 2 or 3 presidential elections. Everyone around me now is talking about wanting to return to pre-pandemic normal. Well, that sounds sweet, folks, but I want to go farther back. I want to go back to pre-Trump normal, when I believed that we had 2 major political parties with different views on lots of things, but that they both loved America, that they both defended the Constitution, and that they both truly believed in democracy. I'm relieved that Joe Biden doesn't even have a Twitter account. Yay! And that he is not so ego deficit that he's constantly in front of a camera trying to get the attention of every news program and the front page of every paper. And that he just more or less goes about his business being a conservative Democrat who pretends to have progressive sympathies. He's not a progressive president. He's not the one I've longed for, but he is at least someone that I can fairly comfortably ignore most of the time. And evidently, I really needed a break, and I suspect that most of you did too. But I will confess that I'm still worried that we might be laying down our swords prematurely. I'm worried that 7 months after the January 6th insurrection in Washington, that just not much has happened to make sure that our failed insurrection is not followed by a successful insurrection. I couldn't believe it on the evening of January 6th that there was this rush to return to normal. Debris was cleared out of the Capitol building. The Senate returned to session to approve the results of the November presidential election. And again, I could not believe my eyes when Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Missouri Senator Josh Hawley just strolled into the Senate and took their seats with smirks on their faces. I thought surely they would have been arrested already, that they wouldn't be allowed to come in and just continue to promote Trump's big lie, which had provoked the insurrection in the first place. Why weren't they behind bars on the night of January 6th? And why, even more, have they been allowed to remain free and still be members of the United States Senate? Is treasonous insurrection not even a crime in America anymore? What we all saw with our own two eyes on January 6th was the former president whipping up a crowd of thousands, sending them to the Capitol with orders to disrupt the constitutional process of certifying the presidential election. His speech was laced with not-so-veiled threats aimed at his own vice president as well as other leaders of the Congress and the Senate. We watched live as Capitol Police were being beaten. We saw rioters breaking out windows and knocking down security barricades and doors. We saw treasonous villains occupying congressional offices, carrying off stolen souvenirs, and even spreading their own feces over priceless pieces of historical art. A few people died in the clash, but it could have easily been much more lethal had not security guards acted quickly to get the vice president and the speakers of the House and the Senate to safety. This is what we saw on the news. What we do not yet know is how many members of Congress and the Senate may have actually given guided tours of the Capitol building the day before the rally, helping the riot organizers to plan their assault, showing them where to find Nancy Pelosi or other people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, or Ilhan Omar, all of whom would very likely be dead now if the rioters had found them. This insurrection, though planned and provoked by none other than the 45th President of the United States, the leader of the Republican Party, the night of January 6th, Senator Mitch McConnell and Senator Lindsey Graham remembered their oath of office, and they stood on the Senate floor and loudly condemned the insurrection and laid the blame at the only place where it could logically be laid, at the feet of Donald Trump. But that fit of conscience and patriotism didn't last very long. Within days, they were back in the Trump orbit. The kind of Republican leaders who went to Richard Nixon and told him that it was time for him to resign do not exist in the Republican Party of today. Did you ever think you would hear a classic liberal like me bemoaning the fact that there are no more Barry Goldwaters? But here's the question I'm imploring you to consider today. Would the Republican Party support a fascist takeover of American democracy if it would allow them to remain in power? Every fiber of our hearts and minds wants to scream in response, no, absolutely not, never. However, all of the evidence, from voter suppression laws in many states to supporters of the big lie who still insist that Trump won the 2020 election by a landslide, to elected officials who are trying to stop any formal investigation of the events of January 6th, we see a clear and undeniable preference for fascism over democracy, and we are seeing it enfleshed in the Republican Party. I know that we don't want it to be true. We want to think that it's all overheated rhetoric, that it will go out of fashion and everything will just remain the same. But friends, I'm afraid that's a luxurious self-deception that we just probably can't afford. Just as I pointed out a Missouri pharmacist who killed thousands of cancer patients for profit, let me point out to you that this is not the first time that the threat of fascism has come to America. Almost a century ago, as the U.S. struggled to come out of the Great Depression, everyone was not a fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. In fact, many feared that Roosevelt was holding the door open to communism. In reaction, many wealthy Americans turned to fascism in the 1930s as a more attractive alternative. So many wealthy Americans feared that the poor would strike out against them in civil war, they actually had machine gun nests built into the roofs of their homes. In those days, both Hitler and Mussolini were guest writers in many popular American newspapers, especially those owned by Randolph Hurst. Business deals were struck between very wealthy Americans and the Hitler regime. In fact, in 1932, the Republican Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania announced on the floor of the Congress, "If this country ever needed a Mussolini, it needs it now." In 1933, a group of wealthy business and media leaders hatched a plot to use disenfranchised World War I veterans to form an army and overthrow the government of Franklin Roosevelt and install a fascist dictator who would protect the rich and keep the poor in servitude, even to the extent of forming forced work camps in which the poor would be doing forced labor to support domestic corporations. You probably didn't hear about that in history class, but I encourage you to look it up. It was known as the business plot, and it included people as well known as media tycoon William Randolph Hurst, chemicals plant owner DuPont, and even Prescott Bush, seen here pictured with Adolf Hitler, with whom he worked and whom he admired prior to becoming the father of President George H.W. Bush and grandfather to George W. Bush. Most historians believe that the business plot might have succeeded had they not made the critical error of trying to recruit Major General Smedley Butler to lead the Army of Veterans. Butler saw through their plans but played along until he had gathered enough evidence and names to go to Congress and testify against the insurrectionists. Although the William Hurst family of newspapers tried their best to belittle General Butler and to deny the plot against the Roosevelt government, Congress was simultaneously aware that he both had the goods on those who had planned and funded the insurrection, while they deleted all of the names from his testimony before they published it, avoiding having to indict people like the Hearst family, the Bush family, the DuPonts, the Sterling family that owned the Singer sewing machine fortune, and the directors of J.P. Morgan. As usual, none of the big names were indicted, but many of the small players were put on trial. And that, men and women, is what I'm afraid may happen in reaction to the insurrection of January 6th. There's been a lot of opposition from Republicans to even investigating the insurrection, which is understandable since if there is a full and comprehensive investigation, very many of them, possibly as many as 100 of them, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. But our history is we let the big fish go and we fry the little fish. Last month, 4 of the brutalized Capitol Hill police officers did sit for questioning in a congressional hearing. The most memorable of them, at least for me, was the testimony of Officer Harry Dunn. He asked the members of Congress not to give up until they get to the bottom of it, to get who caused it. Dunn did not pull any punches when he pointed directly at the former president, comparing Trump to a man who hires an assassin. Dunn said, if a hitman is hired and he kills somebody, the hitman goes to jail. But not only does the hitman go to jail, but the person who hired them does. There was an attack carried out on January 6th, and a hitman sent them. I want you to get to the bottom of that. And that, men and women, is my point. Like you, I am tired of thinking about Trump and his whole corrupt regime. And I am very sad to say that the Republican Party, at least in my mind, is no longer the loyal opposition on the other side of a democratic debate. I believe that they have become an anti-American party bent on the destruction of democracy in favor of fascism. And if we want people of color to be able to vote, for gays, lesbians, bi, and trans folk to live in peace, if we want universal health care and a living wage for everyone, then I believe that we're going to have to make democracy strong again. I believe that the Republican Party as it now exists needs to fade out of existence and be replaced by a patriotic party that can be pro-business, fiscally conservative, pro-defense, and even kind of crazy about free market values, but they can't be fascist. And most importantly, the world needs to see the strongest democracy on the globe actually prove that we believe in equal justice for all. I believe to save America, Donald Trump must be charged with insurrection, tried, and if found guilty, imprisoned along with several members of his family and several minions. I'm not happy to say this. I'm just absolutely convinced that I am right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.